welcome to the Smart KBA Musings, and today's musing is titled as When Systems Drift, reading the tender spots. So you may wonder, what is this now? What are we talking about? What we're going to talk about is looking at changes and how these changes are not something that is instantaneous, because systems drift quickly, and in the process they leave tender spots which sometimes turn into issues, which we in a simplistic fashion want to find out with what we call as regression. So what we're going to talk about, or what we're going to muse about, is look at it very differently. Look at it from 6 movements of drifting, a system quietly drifting, and while existing, something unseen compensates, while the risk waits on the edge, and somehow interesting conditions combine invisibly, and before the system probably reacts violently, it whispers. The question is, are we reading it? And this is an interesting musing, because this was not inspired by testing in the typical sense. It was more from ideas from different domains, starting with one that is probably present in our current country, the elections which just happened. Politics to start with, geography, ecology, personal change, and so on. And look at from those angles of how changes occur and what happens, and therefore what could we seek, possibly some interesting inspiration. Is there a heuristic to figure out how to judge and how to sense the tender spots? Not every major risk that comes out because of any change that occurs announces itself as a failure. We spend a lot of time in software thinking about what has changed, because it's not that we're building brand new code every time. We are fixing, we are modifying, we are enhancing. We're always asking what lines were touched, what test needs to be run, what various PRs and tickets says. But what I want to do is to think about it in the next 30 minutes of something that sits outside this question, and look at changes as possibly risks that are not even inside it at all. But they're all there, they're all accumulating, and they're all hidden by something that is compensating. And that's when I said, look, I'm trying to borrow some of these ideas from the shifting political landscape, inspired by some of the elections that occurred in the southern states and the eastern states, and so on. It's not what changed. It's about asking, where did the system become tender? It was tender. What happened? So let's talk about the drift. Let's talk about it as the first movement. Very recently we had elections in the southern state of Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and of course the eastern state of Bengal. And we had very different political stories. Something interesting happened. People didn't expect some of the shifts. Very different political stories, especially in Tamil Nadu and Bengal. Very different communities, very different grievances. But then one fundamental pattern seemed to be there, which we only understood after the election. The shift, the visible shift, the election result. Right? Incumbency played a significant part. The numbers changed. They came much late. Much later than the drift that caused it. And that's when various political analysts, after the election results were announced, mused about a lot of interesting things. But it was happening, which probably some of them didn't sense it, especially those parties which were in power. The drift was happening in living rooms. Like what? In conversations that happened, in the tone that what was promised and what really happened. People got educated, they became engineers, they spent a lot of money, and they didn't get a job. They became Uber drivers. And they were in their 30s. They moved into 30s. Career didn't seem to have taken off. Did we see the drift? Maybe those people didn't. Nobody called it a political shift at that time. And when this happened, and of course this is just one instance, there must be a few more. The idea is to kind of look at the notion that the visible shifts came late. The drift really had become much earlier. So it is probably more interesting to look at the changes and the drifts and study them rather than just say what is the impact now. Software systems are no different. A feature becomes fragile not because it fails. It becomes fragile slowly, release by release, maybe some exception by exception, a workaround by a workaround, and so on. It's just that we don't catch it, it's harder. And the failure is probably the last event in a long story. So the first moment that I'm going to talk about is from the context of drift, right? Are we able to sense the drift? The Tamil Nadu economic numbers, which always been touted as the Dravidian movement, were strong. They said, we have economic growth, which is in double digits. GDP was up, industrial growth was healthy, literacy rates were, were the best. But one of the data points was the engineering folks, the graduates in the 30s were still driving Uber. They didn't seem to have jobs. Somehow jobs didn't happen. But apparently the economic climate was touted to be healthy, and that was a signal. A signal that probably somebody didn't sense. It was not hidden, it was not sensed. It was in every street. Because that services business in the context of these, the Ubers and the co, the Blinkits and everything was the one that was growing, not anything else. But somehow nobody in power was reading it as a political signal. It was seen as a local issue, explained away, treated as untreated. And you see, the signal was there, unhidden, unread. And then after every change in software that we make, which ultimately results in code, but some of them are internal design changes, some of them are spec changes, some of them are compliance and regulatory changes, ultimately modifications of code. The same kind of signals appear. A flaky test, sometimes we don't investigate, we don't see it filling every time. A support ticket, but then we think it is from an adjacent feature, so we'll pause on it, we'll wait on it. A performance number seemingly out of whack, but then still within tolerance limits, but kind of trending the long way. So all these are subtle. Signals are there, they're subtle. And sometimes, because they're subtle, it's still under the radar. And we don't read it. So all we're trying to muse about is to seek inspiration and muse about it from some of the things that we see outside and say, should we? Could we probably learn from them? Could there be a heuristic late after all at the end? Let's move on to the notion of idea of we drifted, but something compensates quietly. Let's go on from Tamil Nadu to Bengal, West Bengal. The tea gardens in the northern Bengal had distress, decades of distress, low wages, periodic closures, fragile livelihoods. But the system held for a long time. Because of an invisible infrastructure of local arrangements, informal mediations, things that quietly absorb the pressure without anybody fully noticing. Nobody noticed as the system was being held together, compensated, until it weakened. And that's a dangerous moment. It's not when the system kind of runs, it's the support exists. It's when everyone forgets it's there. And in a very similar sense, when you look at software, it has something very similar. There is not always a design decision, there's not always a documented control, there's often a quiet compensation. Maybe a nightly job that repairs bad data, a feature flag that nobody removes, a manual step that nobody normalized and everybody normalized. Maybe a senior developer who remembers why that something should not be touched. The dangerous moment is not when the soft support exists. It's when everybody forgets that the support is what the system made, what it made the system look stable. It compensated. You see, the perturbation is a bit of an oscillation. You disturb, it oscillates a bit, it goes out of whack. At some time, it doesn't happen instantaneously because system kind of absorbs it, compensates it. So the movement too is from drift to compensation. Similarly, we had various welfare schemes in Tamil Nadu, right? The numbers look good. System looks stable. But the aspiration was not still resolved. And the deeper question was, what kind of future can my child have? Was never answered, compensated. The compensation was real. Why? Because we gave them freebies. The cause was not addressed. So the fix. What did this fix make us stop looking? It's like that placid lake that you see which is frozen, but there are cracks. It's compensating. But you probably walk on it or run on that lake, it'll break and you will fall inside the cold water down. Software behaves probably in the similar way, the compensation way. The patch is passed, a test suit says green, a defect disappears from the view, a release moves forward. But underneath, the real weakness is accumulating. The question is not only did the fix work, the sharper question is, what did that fix make us stop looking at? So, see, there is something drifting, somehow it's being compensated, not seeing it. We're just asking a very simpler question, did it break? But then it will break maybe after some time. Now let's move on to the notion of the edge becoming tender. Let's move into the third movement. The movements in Bengal, where there were Gorkhaland movement, there were an assertion, Kamtapur movement, there were various movements that were happening in West Bengal. They were always present, they were contained, they were deferred, they were not resolved. Which means somebody tried to protest, right? It was suppressed, quietened down. But one movement changed the condition, a language policy, a calibrate message, and that became, what had been quiet became visible. And what was electoral noise suddenly became an electoral force. A new change may not create that risk. It may simply give the old risk a way to express itself. In this case, it was the language. So if we kind of shift to software and ask, some risks do not grow loudly, they wait. Like an old defect that was a low priority, sitting on the defect system for a long time. A boundary case that nobody ever saw, nobody sees it often. A behavior that was kind of odd, but then we accepted it. It was seemingly harmless. A dependency that was assumed, but it was kind of stable. And slowly they accumulated it, right? And the new change may not create that risk. In fact, there was a very beautiful book written many years ago. It was titled Ubiquity, which actually talked about that. That it's very ubiquitous, the little change that continues to be there, and it's very ubiquitous, and suddenly it blows up. And the book was written using examples from volcano, earthquake. But the earthquake or a volcano doesn't happen overnight. The risk doesn't happen, it doesn't explode overnight. It happens slowly, changes. And it is when it becomes very tender, when it becomes edgy, then that's when it breaks, right? Now we see coastlines, we see erosion, we see, erosion various forms, and we know that today. A coastline is one where we see erosion physically, but we don't see erosion inside. Right? It doesn't always occur in a place where you're watching. The damage is on the edge. The coastline is taken off. A few feet go away. But inside, trees seem to be there. We don't watch this, right? Because that's a place where land meets something else. Two systems interact. The boundary. So, We are looking for changes inside, but actually its erosion is happening maybe a feet at a time from the outside. So this is in a way being inspired by the constant continual erosion that's kind of chugging away, taking away a centimeter, an inch, a foot of the land one at a time. So, just like in software, right? The most dangerous place is not about inside, it is just outside it, like the neighboring flow, the adjacent state, the downstream report, the integration we never touched, or the rollback path we did not rehearse, the adjacency, not the inside. And therefore the impact analysis, by just looking at it from inside, possibly sometimes becomes weak because it simply has what changed. It becomes sharper when we ask what sits next to the change and what is now under newer pressure. So there is a drift, it becomes tender, and now we are looking at it from the erosion from the outside rather than just focusing on the inside. And every change that we inherit, it inherits assumptions we cannot see. Because we all have some kind of institutional memory that lives in rules and processes. And when rules continue on, we kind of make it a ritual, right? And we don't ask, why are we following this? The ritual remains, the memory fades. And therefore we just follow the rule faithfully. Not because we understand it, because it's just that's how it's been done. So we all have inherited memories, right? We use words which reflect that. We do review, we do stand-ups, we do sanity, various stuff. We do certain validation, but nobody knows why. It's there as a process instrumented by a tool, a sequence that is followed, but nobody determines what's the original failure. Sometimes we know the field cannot be changed or modified. We don't know why that was done. What's the whole conversation? There are assumptions that were made along the way which are forgotten. The risk is not only in what the developer changed. It is really in what the developer, for example, unknowingly believed would always be true. So the change inherits in assumptions it cannot see. And therefore, there is a constant, continual erosion that's happening on the outside. So we talked about 3 movements, let's move to the 4th one. A forest may be cleared in one place, which is happening today as part of economic development, right? A forest is being cleared to make way for urbanization. Areas are being built. A city, by the way, is heating. And we know every urban system today, the average temperature is much higher. City is heating. We see microclimates, we see shift in rainfall patterns. Each one of them probably look tolerable, we are able to manage. But what is happening is the microclimate is changing irreversibly. The change is not only the code, it is also the condition under which the code entered the system. Right? We removed forests, we added some stuff. And a software risk appears this way: a small code change, a tight deadline, an unfamiliar developer, a brittle dependency, maybe a weak review, maybe a environment of test which is kind of noisy. None of them look by itself alarming. But together, they change the surface of risk. And the change is not the code. It is the condition of how the code entered the system. In the case of the urban development, we are motivated by growth and GDP, so we are clearing off lands. And therefore, we are shutting down, we are filling lakes, we are expanding roads, and so on. The condition is we are trying to make way for economic development. Very similarly, we say, hey, let's give this to a developer who probably is new or not familiar with this, or we are operating under a tight deadline, and so on. So the conditions matter, right? The conditions around the change when it occurred matter, not just the change. when somebody, for example, undergoes significant personal change, maybe you get married, or maybe my belief system changed, what they stop doing often matters more what they start. And their absence is the signal. So my belief systems change, I don't do. Maybe my personal status change, so certain things I'm doing, I'm not doing anymore. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the fact that there might be certain signals in the way I have changed doing things. And those absence matters. So what the developer chose not to touch, not to change, may be as revealing as what they changed. So we're not talking about what has occurred has changed, but we're also worried about the fact the conditions of change and also what has not been changed. Files not touched, tests not updated, data parts not revisited, old assumptions not, let's say, challenged, adjacent behaviors left alone. When a developer chose not to touch it, is important to understand. Because the boundary of change is often its dangerous edge. Now you might have seen some pictures. This is an example of a river where it shifted course. There are rivers which have actually changed course. In this case, it has shifted. As you can see, one area is dry and it has shifted to the, a nearby course, and it has occurred. Every system carries certain defaults. Some are written, some are not. A component assumes it behaves in a certain way. A service assumes an upstream response. A workflow assumes a user reaches it through one path. A report assumes a field meant what a field meant it was released 5, let's say, releases ago. The problem of these defaults and the earlier stuff is the new change collides with them. It collides, things shift. So why does the river change course direction? Because of a dam that was built early on, and therefore it changed. And we didn't know why it happened, right? It takes many years for us to know. So the failure that occurs now will appear far away from the change. The shifting course of a river charting out a new course does not occur overnight. It occurred because the change occurred many years ago, and slowly the path changed. The cause may have traveled quietly through a path nobody thought. Some risks do not break when they begin. They surface elsewhere softly, maybe indirectly, maybe almost politely. So it's not about the fact that, a change that occurs here would kind of cause, which we sometimes also call as the butterfly effect. A change occurring, a butterfly flapping the wings in Sao Paulo probably causes a typhoon in Tokyo. That's the butterfly effect, right? It occurs slowly, the shift. So the system may not be broken. Like, the core of the IC core, people research by looking at, IC cores. So they dig an ice core to understand what happened thousands or tens of thousands or millions of years ago, and ice preserves it. And IC cores do not announce the climate health directly. They preserve signals. They preserve layers of atmosphere, trapped air, ancient temperature, and they ask to be interpreted. The scientist does not wait for the glacier to collapse. They read the ice. So what we're trying to do is to look at the IC core of the past and possibly read what it is whispering to us. Because it's not yet broken. But maybe now we'll know what could possibly happen. It is maybe telling you where it is possibly tender. Software systems speak very indirectly, like a flaky test, a slower screen, maybe a support which gets the same question many times, a defect in an adjacent module, a manual workaround that we kind of take it for granted and we keep on doing it and becomes routine. These are not distractions from testing. These are kind of clues for attention. The system is not yet broken, but it's telling you something. And are we reading the whisper? And therefore, this is not more testing. It is better attention. Because we more often treat retesting as repetition, run again, confirm again, regress, close it. But after a meaningful change, a regression or retesting can become something very different, a reading practice, not just does the change behavior work. It's also about what was the system already compensating, what old risk may become a trigger, what new neighbor is under pressure, what assumption lost its original context, what indirect signal deserves an attention. And when that fix looks successful, do not just ask what it corrected. Ask what made it invisible. Better attention. And the last movement is voter did not shift in a day, and therefore suddenly, this party was in power, got thrown out overnight with hardly any votes. The coastline did not suddenly collapse. A software system does not become fragile in just a release. The drift was always there. It's already there, quiet, patient, normalized. The change did not always create the weakness. It only touched a tender spot. Like you see the skin on the left, a tender spot. You aggravate it a little more, then it becomes, it flares into probably a serious injury at some point in time. So it's not a checklist, it's not a framework, it's not a demand for tests, it's not a different, but it's asking for a different quality of attention. It's asking not only what changed, but where the system was tender. The drift is always there. In politics, in coastlines, in software. The question is not what broke. It is, were you reading it? Were you reading the drift, the whisper, the outline? And today, with AI, code seems cheaper, faster. So it's probably time for us to spend. We have now more time, probably aided with technology, to do what we're talking about, and therefore not just blindly regress. So in summary, think of these as maybe potentially practical lenses. So we mused about a variety of interesting things inspired by politics and geography and so on and so forth. But if you look at it, they're summarized as these various lenses. The slow burn lens, which kind of asks, where has the drift been accumulating quietly? To the whisper map, which says, what is the system already showing me indirectly, and so on. And finally, the lens of a crack finder, which simply is trying to ask the question, what safe conditions have been combined into an unseen risk? In a way, you might treat these as maybe heuristics that one can discern, which helps us to do smart assurance. Thank you.